There is a question that most people spend their entire lives running away from, and that question is this. If everything you have right now, every excuse, every limitation, every reason why you cannot start, why you cannot try, why you cannot win, if all of that disappeared tomorrow, what would you do with your life? Think about that. Not quickly. Really think about it. Because most people never answer that question honestly. And that is exactly why most people never change. They live inside the boundaries of what feels safe, what feels familiar, what other people told them was possible. And they call that living. But deep inside, in a place they rarely visit, they know there is more. You know there is more. And that feeling, that hunger, that restlessness, that is not a problem. That is a signal. Welcome to English to Inspire, the place where you learn English and rebuild your mind at the same time, where every word you hear is a tool for your language and a weapon for your life. If this is your first time here, stay close. Because what we do in this channel is not just teach you English. We teach you how to think, how to endure, and how to rise. And if you feel this channel is giving you something real, something that other places do not give you, then take 2 seconds right now and subscribe. Because the journey we are going on together is long, and you do not want to miss a single step of it. Today we are going to talk about a man who grew up with nothing. Not in a poetic way, not in a way that makes a good introduction, but in a real, cold, uncomfortable way. A boy in a crowded apartment in the Bronx in New York. The son of immigrant parents, wearing clothes that did not fit, dreaming about a world he had never touched and had no map to reach. His name is Ralph Lauren. And today he is worth billions of dollars. And his name is on buildings and stores and suits worn by presidents and kings. But none of that is the real story. The real story is what happened before all of that, in the silence of a small room where a boy decided that his circumstances were not his destiny. That gap, the gap between where you are and where you want to be, is something you know personally, and do not pretend that you do not. Because you are here, you are listening, and people who are fully satisfied with their lives do not search for inspiration at this hour. Something brought you here. Something inside you is not finished yet. Something in you is still fighting, even when your energy is low and your results are slow and the people around you do not understand what you are trying to build. That something is the most important thing you own. And it is the same thing that Ralph Lauren owned when he had nothing else. He was not the smartest kid in school. He was not the most connected. He did not have money or mentors or a clear path forward. But he had something that cannot be bought and cannot be given. He had a vision so clear and so burning that it survived years of doubt and rejection and failure. And that vision eventually became one of the most powerful brands in the history of the world. And we are going to walk through how that happened, step by step. Because his story is not just history. It is a mirror. And if you look at it honestly, you will see yourself inside it. Ralph Lauren was born Ralph Lifshitz in the Bronx, New York, in 1939, the youngest of 4 children in a family of Jewish immigrants from Belarus. And from the very first years of his life, he understood something that most children do not have to understand so early, which is that the world outside your window can look completely different from the world inside your home. And that difference can either crush you or fuel you. And for Ralph, from a very young age, it became fuel. His father, Frank, was a house painter, a hard-working and honest man, but the family had very little money, and the apartment they lived in was small and full of people and noise. And the Bronx in those years was not a place that whispered possibilities into the ears of young boys. It was a place that taught you to be realistic, to stay in your lane, to not want too much. But Ralph did not listen to that lesson. And that is the first thing you need to understand about him. Because the environment you grow up in has a voice, a loud and persistent voice, and that voice tells you what you are worth and what is possible for someone like you. And most people absorb that voice without even realizing it. They carry it into adulthood, and they call it being practical. They call it being responsible. but really it is just the echo of a limited world speaking through them. And Ralph somehow, at an age when most children simply accept the world as it is, decided that the voice of his environment was not the final word on his life. He looked at the world outside, at magazines, at movies, at the way certain people carried themselves, and he felt something ignite inside him that never went out. From a very young age, Ralph was obsessed with clothes, not in a superficial way, not in the way a child wants a toy, but in a deep and almost philosophical way. He understood instinctively that the way a person dressed was a language, that it communicated something about who they were and who they wanted to be, and he wanted to speak that language fluently. He wanted to wear it, and eventually he wanted to create it. And so, even as a teenager with almost no money, he found ways to dress well. He saved. He searched. He pieced together outfits that felt like they belonged to a different world than the one he came from. And his classmates noticed, and some of them laughed. But Ralph did not care, because he was not dressing for them. He was dressing for the version of himself that only he could see clearly. This is the part of his story that most people skip over because it is not dramatic enough. There is no single crisis here, no explosion, no obvious turning point, just a quiet and stubborn boy in a crowded city who refused to accept that his starting point was his ending point. And that refusal, that daily, silent, unglamorous refusal, is actually the most important chapter of everything that came after. Because the habits of the mind that Ralph built in those early years, the habit of seeing beyond the present, the habit of not letting outside voices define inside worth, those habits were the real foundation of the empire. Not the money, not the connections, not the talent, just the refusal to stop imagining. And here is where his story stops being about him and starts being about you. Because you also have a voice in your environment. Maybe it is the voice of a city that does not believe in dreamers. Maybe it is the voice of a family that loves you, but cannot see your vision. Maybe it is the voice inside your own head that keeps replaying old failures and old limitations. And the question is not whether that voice exists. It does. The question is whether you are going to let it write the ending of your story. Because Ralph Lauren answered that question in the Bronx, with empty pockets and a full imagination. And the answer he gave changed everything. There is a moment in every person's life where they stop waiting for permission and decide to act. And for Ralph Lauren, that moment came in 1967, when he was working as a salesman for a necktie manufacturer called Bob, doing his job, earning his salary, living inside someone else's vision, and feeling every single day that something was wrong. Not wrong in a way that made him angry, but wrong in a way that made him restless. Because Ralph had ideas, big ideas. Ideas that did not fit inside the small space he had been given. And one day he walked into his boss's office and proposed something that at the time sounded almost absurd. He wanted to design his own line of ties. Wider ties. More luxurious ties. Ties that felt like they belonged to a world of elegance and aspiration. And his boss looked at him and said no. And that no, that single rejection became the first brick in the foundation of a billion-dollar empire. Most people hear the word no, and they translate it as stop. They treat rejection as information about their own worth. They internalize it, and they shrink. And this is one of the most dangerous habits a human being can develop. Because no rarely means you are wrong. It usually means the person in front of you cannot see what you see. And the ability to hold your vision clearly, even when the people around you refuse to validate it, is one of the rarest and most powerful skills that exists. And Ralph Lauren had that skill in abundance. Because when his boss said no, he did not go home and question his dream. He went home and decided to build it himself. Alone. With almost no money, and no guarantee of anything, except his own unshakable belief that what he was imagining was real, and it was worth fighting for. He started with a loan of $50,000, a tiny amount for building a business even in those years. And he set up a small operation and began producing his wide, luxurious ties under a name he chose very carefully. A name that sounded like open fields and horses and old money and freedom. A name that had nothing to do with a small apartment in the Bronx and everything to do with the world he had been imagining since he was a child. And that name was Polo. And when he took those ties to the buyers at Bloomingdale's department store, one of the most prestigious stores in New York, they were interested, but they had a condition. They told him he needed to put the Bloomingdale's label on the ties instead of his own. And Ralph Lauren looked at them and said no. Think about what that moment cost him. Because this was not a man with a safety net. This was not a man with a backup plan or a wealthy family or another opportunity waiting in line. This was a man with $50,000 in debt and one shot at getting his product into a major store. And he said no. Because he understood something that most people spend their whole lives trying to learn, which is that if you give up your name, your identity, your vision, in exchange for access, you have already lost the most important thing. You have traded the dream for the appearance of the dream. And Ralph Lauren refused to do that. And eventually Bloomingdale's agreed to sell his ties under his name. And within a short time, those ties were selling faster than anyone expected. That victory, small as it might sound, was not small at all. It was proof. Proof that the vision was real. Proof that the market wanted what he was imagining. Proof that the voice of the environment that had told him to be realistic and stay in his lane was wrong. And when you get that first proof, that first moment where reality confirms what you believed when no one else did, something changes permanently inside you. Your confidence is no longer theoretical. It is built on evidence. And evidence is a foundation that no rejection can easily destroy. And Ralph Lauren stood on that foundation and began to build. One step at a time, one product at a time, one refusal to quit at a time. And the world was about to find out exactly what he was capable of. After the ties started selling, Ralph Lauren did not slow down. He did not celebrate for long. He did not look around and decide that what he had was enough. Because that is not how people who build empires think. They are wired differently. They feel the wind for a moment, and then immediately their eyes move to the next horizon. And Ralph's next horizon was enormous. Because he did not want to just sell ties. He wanted to build an entire world. A complete universe of clothing and lifestyle that spoke to something deep in the American imagination. A world of wide open spaces and quiet elegance and effortless confidence. And to build that world, he needed more than a good product. He needed a base of operations. He needed a real company. And in 1968, he officially launched Polo Ralph Lauren as a full menswear line, operating out of a single small office inside the Empire State Building, one of the most iconic buildings in New York, which was either a brilliant statement of ambition or a slightly crazy decision for a man with very little capital. And knowing what we know about Ralph Lauren, it was probably both. That office was tiny, and the team was small, and every single day was a grind of phone calls and meetings and rejections and slow progress. And if you have ever tried to build something from nothing, you know exactly what that feels like. You know the feeling of waking up with energy and ending the day with exhaustion and very little visible result. You know the feeling of believing in something that the world has not yet confirmed. You know the loneliness of carrying a vision that other people cannot fully see or understand. And Ralph Lauren lived inside that feeling for years. Not days, not weeks, but years. And he kept going, not because it was easy, but because the alternative, which was to stop, to go back, to accept a smaller life, was simply not something his mind would allow him to do. The early years of Polo Ralph Lauren were defined by one central idea that separated Ralph from almost every other designer of his time. And that idea was this. He was not selling clothes. He was selling a dream. He was selling an identity. He was selling the feeling of belonging to a world that most of his customers had never actually lived in, but had always longed for. And this understanding, this almost psychological insight into what people truly buy when they buy something beautiful, was the engine of everything. Because when you understand that people do not buy products, they buy feelings and identities and versions of themselves that they want to become. You stop competing on price and you start competing on meaning. And meaning is something that cannot be copied easily and cannot be discounted. He expanded the line rapidly, moving from ties into full suits and then into women's clothing, and then into home furnishings and fragrances, and everything in between. And at every step the philosophy remained the same. Quality that felt timeless, imagery that felt aspirational, and a consistency of vision so strong that you could walk into any Ralph Lauren store anywhere in the world and immediately feel the same world, the same dream, the same promise. And building that consistency required an obsessive attention to detail that most people would find exhausting. But for Ralph, it was not exhausting. It was the work. It was the point. It was the thing that made him feel most alive. And when you find the work that makes you feel most alive, you do not watch the clock. You feed it everything you have. And here is the lesson that this chapter of his life is screaming at you right now. Because you might be in the early phase of something. You might be in that office, metaphorically speaking, small and underfunded, and moving slower than you want to move. And the temptation in that phase is to doubt the vision, to scale it down, to make it more realistic, to listen to the voice that says maybe you are aiming too high. And Ralph Lauren's answer to that voice, delivered not in words, but in decades of disciplined action, is that the vision is not the problem. The patience is the practice. The grind is not the obstacle. The grind is the path. And if you can hold your vision clearly while doing the unglamorous daily work of building it piece by piece, you are already doing the thing that most people give up on before they ever see results. There is a difference between a businessman and a visionary, and that difference is not talent, and it is not luck, and it is not even hard work. Because there are millions of hardworking business people in the world who build solid companies and earn good livings and never change anything. And then there are the rare few who do something completely different, who do not just build a product or a service, but build a world. A complete and immersive world that pulls people in and makes them feel something. And Ralph Lauren belongs to that second category. So completely and so totally that it is almost impossible to talk about fashion in the 20th century without talking about him. Because what he did was not just design clothes. What he did was redefine what a brand could be, what a brand could mean, what a brand could make a person feel. And that redefinition changed the entire industry and sent ripples through every sector of business that are still felt today. Before Ralph Lauren, most fashion brands sold products. They showed you a jacket or a dress or a pair of shoes, and they told you it was well made, and it was stylish, and you should buy it. And that approach worked. It sold clothes. But it did not create loyalty, and it did not create belonging, and it did not create the kind of deep emotional connection that makes a customer feel that choosing a brand is an expression of who they are. And Ralph understood this gap intuitively. He understood it the way a musician understands rhythm. Not because someone explained it to him, but because he felt it. He had been doing it his whole life. He had been using clothes as a language of identity since he was a teenager in the Bronx. And now he simply scaled that personal truth into a global language that millions of people could speak. He built entire worlds in his advertising campaigns, and this was radical at the time. His advertisements did not show a single product on a white background with a price. They showed a lifestyle. They showed a family on a sailboat. They showed a weekend in the countryside. They showed horse races in old wood and leather and linen and the particular quality of light on a summer afternoon, somewhere beautiful and And the person looking at that advertisement did not just see a shirt. They saw a life. They saw a version of themselves that felt more free and more elegant and more complete than their current reality. And they wanted it. Not just the shirt, but the feeling. And the only way to get the feeling, or at least the closest available version of it, was to buy the shirt. And that is a completely different transaction than simply purchasing clothing. This philosophy, this understanding that the most powerful thing a brand can sell is not a product, but a story, not an object, but an aspiration, is one of the most important business lessons of the last 100 years. And it applies far beyond fashion. It applies to every single thing you are building or planning to build. Because whatever your product is, whatever your service is, whatever your skill is, there is a version of it that is just functional, and there is a version of it that is meaningful. And the meaningful version is always worth more. It commands more loyalty and more price and more word of mouth and more longevity. And the difference between the two versions is not the product itself. The difference is the story you build around it, and the clarity of vision you bring to everything you touch. Ralph Lauren never compromised that vision. Not when investors pushed him to expand too fast. Not when trends moved in directions that contradicted his aesthetic. Not when competitors scoped his imagery and tried to undercut his prices. He held the vision with both hands and refused to let it drift. And people could feel that refusal. Customers could feel it in the weight of the fabric and the consistency of the stores and the unchanging dignity of the brand. And that feeling of solidity and permanence in a world that changes constantly is itself a form of luxury. And it is a form of loyalty that money cannot manufacture. It can only be earned through years of uncompromising dedication to something you believe in deeply and completely. Which is exactly what Ralph Lauren gave to his brand every single day for decades. And the world rewarded him for it in ways that even he could not have fully imagined. Standing in that tiny office in the Empire State Building, there is a lie that success tells you, and the lie sounds like this. Once you reach a certain level, once you build something real and recognized and valuable, the danger is over. The hard part is behind you, and from here the path is smoother and the risks are smaller and the fear is quieter. And Ralph Lauren believed some version of that lie in the late 1980s. Not consciously, not naively, but in the way that any person who has worked incredibly hard for decades and built something undeniably powerful begins to feel. That the foundation is solid enough to hold anything. And then the early 1990s arrived, and the economy shifted, and the retail landscape changed. And the debt that had accumulated during years of aggressive expansion became suddenly and terrifyingly visible, and Polo Ralph Lauren, one of the most recognized brands in the world, found itself standing at the edge of financial collapse. The numbers were brutal and the pressure was immense, and the fear was real, because this was not just Ralph Lauren's personal fortune at stake. This was the livelihoods of thousands of employees. This was the legacy he had spent his entire adult life constructing brick by brick with his hands and his vision and his refusal to quit. And now, all of it was genuinely at risk. And the people around him were scared, and the advisors were cautious, and the banks were watching closely. And in that atmosphere of fear and uncertainty, Ralph Lauren had to make decisions that would determine whether everything he had built would survive or collapse. And the weight of that responsibility was the kind of weight that breaks most people. The kind of weight that turns vision into paralysis and courage into hesitation. But here's what happened. And pay close attention to this part, because this is where character reveals itself. Not in the good years. Not in the years of growth and celebration and magazine covers, but in the years of crisis. In the years when the comfortable story falls apart, and you are left standing in the middle of something that feels like it might be the end. And what Ralph Lauren did in that moment was not panic, and it was not denial, and it was not the kind of desperate scrambling that destroys companies faster than any recession. What he did was go back to the foundation, back to the core of what the brand was, and what it stood for, and why it existed. And he made the difficult decision to restructure, to cut what needed to be cut, to bring in outside help in the form of a private equity partnership that gave the company the financial stability it needed to survive and then to grow again. That decision, bringing in Goldman Sachs as an investment partner in 1994, was not easy for a man whose entire identity was built around independence and personal vision. Because accepting outside capital means accepting outside voices, and Ralph Lauren had spent his whole career protecting his vision from exactly that kind of dilution. But wisdom is knowing the difference between compromising your vision and saving the vehicle that carries it. And Ralph was wise enough in that moment of crisis to understand that a brand that does not survive cannot inspire anyone, that a dream that collapses under the weight of avoidable debt helps nobody. And so he made the pragmatic choice without abandoning the philosophical one. He saved the company so the company could continue to mean something. And this is the part of his story that most people never talk about, because it is not as glamorous as the rise, and not as dramatic as a total collapse. But it is the most important part for you to hear right now, because you are going to face a moment like this. Maybe you already have, a moment where what you have built is threatened. where the gap between your vision and your current reality feels like it might be permanent, where fear has a louder voice than faith. And the question in that moment is not whether you are afraid. You will be afraid. The question is what you do with the fear. Whether you let it make your decisions or whether you acknowledge it and then set it aside and ask yourself what the foundation requires right now, what the vision needs right now, what the next right step is, even if you cannot see the full staircase. And Ralph Lauren answered that question with courage and clarity, and the answer he gave saved everything. There is something that happens to a person who survives a real crisis, not a small inconvenience, not a temporary setback, but a genuine, existential threat to everything they have built and everything they are. And what happens is not simply relief. It is not just gratitude. It is a kind of clarity that only comes from having stood at the edge of losing it all and choosing to fight anyway. And Ralph Lauren came out of the crisis of the early 1990s with exactly that kind of clarity, a sharper understanding of what the brand was, a deeper respect for the discipline required to sustain it, and a renewed hunger that most people assumed would have faded in a man who had already achieved so much. But hunger does not fade in people like Ralph Lauren. It evolves. It becomes more focused and more precise and more dangerous. And the second half of the 1990s was about to show the world exactly what a focused and financially restructured Polo Ralph Lauren was capable of. The rebuilding process was methodical and disciplined. Every decision was measured against the core identity of the brand. Every expansion was evaluated not just for its financial potential, but for whether it served the vision or diluted it. And this discipline, this willingness to say no to opportunities that did not align with the deeper purpose, is something that separates great brands from merely successful ones. Because the temptation when you are rebuilding is to say yes to everything, to chase every revenue stream, to prioritize short-term recovery over long-term integrity. And Ralph Lauren resisted that temptation with the same stubbornness that had defined him since he was a teenager in the Bronx, deciding that his circumstances were not his destiny. And the brand emerged from the restructuring period stronger and more focused than it had been before the crisis. And then in 1997, Ralph Lauren did something that changed the company permanently and announced to the entire business world that Polo Ralph Lauren was not a story that was ending, but a story that was just reaching its most powerful chapter. He took the company public, listing it on the New York Stock Exchange, and the reception was extraordinary. Investors recognized immediately what they were buying into. Not just a clothing company, not just a fashion brand, but a genuinely iconic American institution with a global reach and a depth of brand loyalty that was almost impossible to replicate. And the IPO raised hundreds of millions of dollars and gave the company the resources to expand globally in a way that had never been possible before. And Ralph Lauren stood at that moment as proof of something that the world needs to be reminded of regularly, which is that the story is never over until you decide it is over. The years that followed the IPO were years of extraordinary growth. New product lines, international expansion, flagship stores in the most prestigious locations in the world, collaborations and cultural moments that embedded the brand deeper into the global consciousness than ever before. And through all of it, Ralph Lauren remained the creative center of everything. Not as a figure, not as a name on a door, but as the actual creative force, the person whose taste and vision and obsessive attention to detail shaped every decision. And this is remarkable not just because of the scale of what he was overseeing, but because of the consistency. Because the Ralph Lauren of the late 90s and the 2000s felt exactly like the Ralph Lauren of the 60s and the 70s. The same dream, the same world, the same uncompromising commitment to a particular kind of beauty and aspiration, just bigger and more powerful and more widely shared. And what does this chapter say to you right now in your life, wherever you are in your own journey? Because if you are rebuilding something after a failure or a crisis, if you are in the painful and unglamorous work of putting things back together after they fell apart, then Ralph Lauren's comeback is not just an interesting business story. It is a direct message to you. It is evidence that the valley is not the end of the mountain. It is part of the mountain. It is the part that tests whether you deserve the view from the top. and the people who make it back from genuine crisis, who rebuild with discipline and clarity and renewed purpose, do not just return to where they were, they go further, because they carry something that cannot be taught in any school or bought with any amount of money. They carry the hard knowledge of what it costs to almost lose everything, and what it feels like to choose every single day to keep going anyway. If you study the life of Ralph Lauren long enough and carefully enough, you begin to notice something that is not immediately obvious when you look at the clothes, or the stores, or the advertisements, or the financial numbers. And what you notice is that underneath all of it, underneath the empire and the wealth and the global recognition, there is a philosophy, a coherent and deeply personal set of beliefs about life and quality and time and identity that has guided every single decision he has ever made. And this philosophy is not something he invented in a boardroom or developed with the help of consultants. It is something he has lived from the very beginning, from the boy in the Bronx, who understood instinctively that the way you present yourself to the world is a statement about what you believe you are worth. And that philosophy scaled into a global empire without losing a single drop of its original essence. And that is the miracle. Not the money, not the fame, but the fact that a personal truth, held with enough conviction and expressed with enough consistency, can become a universal language. The first pillar of that philosophy is the rejection of trends. And this is deeply counterintuitive in an industry that is literally built on the idea that what is desirable changes every season. Because fashion by definition is supposed to be temporary, supposed to be about what is new and what is now and what will be replaced next year. But Ralph Lauren never believed in that model. He believed in timelessness. He believed that quality and elegance, and a certain kind of understated confidence, do not expire. They do not go out of style, because they were never in style in the temporary sense. They exist above the cycle of trends, in a place where things are simply good and always will be. And by anchoring his entire brand to that belief, he created something that fashion could not touch, something that was immune to the seasonal anxiety that destroys most designers and most brands eventually. The second pillar is discipline. And by discipline, Ralph Lauren does not mean rigidity or the inability to adapt. He means the daily practice of returning to your core vision no matter what distraction, or pressure, or temptation is pulling you away from it. The practice of asking every single day whether what you are doing serves the thing you are trying to build, or whether it is just noise. And this kind of discipline is extraordinarily difficult to maintain over decades, because the world is constantly offering you shortcuts, and detours and reasons to compromise. And most people take those shortcuts, not because they are weak, but because the shortcuts feel reasonable in the moment. They feel like smart adaptations. But accumulated over years, those small compromises become the distance between the life imagined and the life you actually built. And Ralph Lauren refused to accumulate that distance. The third pillar is personal integrity. And this means something very specific in the context of his life. It means that he never separated who he was from what he made. He never treated his brand as a product that existed apart from his own values, and his own taste, and his own deepest sense of what was beautiful and what was worth creating. And because of that inseparability, the brand has a soul. It has a genuine human center that people can feel even when they cannot articulate exactly what they are feeling. And that soul is what creates the loyalty that goes beyond rational consumer behavior. The loyalty that makes a person feel that choosing Ralph Lauren is not just a purchasing decision, but a statement about the kind of life they believe in and the kind of person they are trying to become. Now bring all of this directly into your own life and your own work, because these three pillars, the rejection of what is merely trendy in favor of what is truly valuable, the daily discipline of returning to your core vision, and the personal integrity of never separating who you are from what you create. These are not fashion principles. They are life principles. They are the principles that determine whether what you build has depth or just surface, whether it lasts or just flickers, whether it means something or just generates noise. And the beautiful and uncomfortable truth is that applying these principles costs nothing financially and everything personally, because they require you to know yourself clearly, to hold your ground consistently, and to choose the long, difficult road of building something real over the short, easy road of building something fast. And that choice, made daily, made quietly, made without applause or guarantee, is the choice that Ralph Lauren made his entire life, and the choice that is waiting for you right now. There is a version of success that the world shows you in magazines and on screens, and in the highlight reels of other people's lives, and that version is clean and bright and It is the version where the hard work is invisible, and the sacrifice is edited out, and what remains is only the result. The beautiful house, the powerful company, the respected name. And if you consume enough of that version, you begin to unconsciously believe that the people who achieve those things are somehow different from you in a fundamental way, that they were protected from the kind of pain and fear and doubt that you carry. And Ralph Lauren's life, when you look at it fully and honestly, is one of the most powerful arguments against that belief. Because this is a man who built one of the greatest empires in the history of American business, and then sat in a doctor's office in 1987 and heard words that reduced all of that, every store and every dollar and every achievement, to complete irrelevance in a single moment, because the doctor told him he had a brain tumor. The tumor was called a meningioma, and while it was not immediately life-threatening in the way that some diagnoses are, the surgery required to remove it was serious, and the recovery was long, and the experience of confronting your own physical vulnerability when you have spent your entire life operating from a position of vision and control and forward momentum is a particular kind of humbling that no amount of wealth or success can shield you from. And Ralph Lauren went through that experience with the same quiet strength that had defined his response to every other crisis in his life, not with dramatic public declarations, not with the kind of performative resilience that people display when they want to be admired for their suffering, but with a private determination to get through it and return to the work and the life he loved. And he did. He recovered, and he came back, and the brand continued, and the world kept turning, and he kept building. But that experience changed something in him, as genuine confrontations with mortality always do. It sharpened his understanding of what actually matters. It deepened his appreciation for the work not as a means to an end, but as the thing itself, the thing worth being alive for. And it also redirected some of his enormous energy toward something beyond the brand, toward giving back in ways that reflected the values he had always held privately. And one of the most powerful expressions of that giving is the work of the Ralph Lauren Center for Cancer Care in New York, a facility he funded to provide cancer treatment to underserved communities, to the people who cannot afford the kind of care that his own wealth allowed him to access. And in that gesture, in that specific and personal act of generosity, you see the full circle of a life that started in a small apartment with very little and grew into something vast enough to shelter other people from the storms it once faced alone. His commitment to the American flag is another expression of that same depth of character, because Ralph Lauren has spent millions of his own dollars preserving and restoring historic American flags, including the flag that inspired the national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner itself. And this is not the action of a man who sees patriotism as a marketing strategy. This is the action of a man who feels a genuine and personal debt to the country that gave a poor immigrant family's youngest son the space and the freedom to become something extraordinary. And when you understand that context, when you understand that Ralph Lauren looks at the American flag and sees not just a symbol but a personal promise that was kept, the gesture becomes something deeply moving and deeply instructive about what it means to remember where you came from, even after you have traveled very far from it. And this is the lesson of this chapter. Not the tumor and not the philanthropy as isolated facts, but the through line that connects them, which is that a life of genuine substance is not measured only in what you accumulate, but in what you do with what you have been given, in whether you use your position and your resources and your platform to create something beyond yourself, something that outlasts the years of your own active striving, and continues to serve and inspire long after the daily grind has ended. And Ralph Lauren understood this, not as an obligation, but as the natural completion of a life lived with purpose. Because a man who builds a dream powerful enough to inspire millions of strangers has a responsibility to those strangers that goes beyond the product. And he accepted that responsibility fully and quietly and consistently, the same way he accepted every other responsibility in his life. Which is to say, without fanfare, and without hesitation, and with everything he had. You have been listening for a long time now. And if you have stayed with this story from the beginning, from that boy in the Bronx with empty pockets and a burning imagination all the way to this moment, then something in you recognized something in him. And that recognition is not accidental. It is not a coincidence of entertainment or curiosity. It is a signal. The same kind of signal that Ralph Lauren felt as a child looking at a world that seemed impossibly far from where he stood. The signal that says, there is more. The signal that says, what you are living right now is not the final version of your life. The signal that says the distance between where you are and where you could be is not a wall. It is a road. And roads exist to be walked. And the only question that has ever mattered, the only question that separated the people who changed their lives from the people who only dreamed about changing them, is whether you are willing to walk it. Because here is the truth that this entire story has been building toward. And it is not a comfortable truth. It is not the kind of truth that makes you feel good about where you are right now. It is the kind of truth that makes you feel the weight of your own potential pressing down on you like a hand on your shoulder, demanding your attention, demanding your honesty. And the truth is this: you already know what you need to do. You already know the thing you have been postponing, the call you have not made, the project you have not started, the habit you have not built, the version of yourself you have not yet had the courage to commit to. And Ralph Lauren did not have more information than you. He did not have a better map, or a clearer guarantee, or a safer path. He had a vision, and a refusal, and a willingness to begin with what he had in the place where he stood. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It built an empire that the entire world recognizes. Think about what he faced. Not the glamorous version, not the curated retrospective, but the real version. The years of rejection when no one could see what he saw. The financial crisis that threatened to destroy everything he had spent decades building. The doctor's office, and the diagnosis, and the long recovery. The daily weight of carrying a vision that the world had not yet confirmed. And through all of it, he did not wait for conditions to be perfect. He did not wait for fear to disappear. He did not wait for someone to give him permission, or a guarantee, or a sign that it was safe to keep going. He simply kept going, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one refusal to quit at a time. And the accumulation of those days, and those decisions, and those refusals became one of the most extraordinary lives in the history of American business. And now the story returns to you, because that is where it was always going. That is why you were drawn to it. Not to admire someone else's journey from a safe distance, but to use it as a mirror, to hold it up to your own life and ask the uncomfortable questions. How much of your potential are you actually using right now? How many days have passed recently that you cannot account for? How many times have you told yourself that you will start tomorrow, and then watch tomorrow become next week, and next week become next year? Because time does not negotiate. It does not wait for you to feel ready. It does not pause while you build your confidence, or clear your schedule, or find the perfect moment. It moves. It always moves. And every day that passes is a day that was either used or surrendered, and you cannot get it back. Not 1 hour of it. Not 1 minute. Not 1 second. Ralph Lauren started with a tie. One product, one vision, one refusal to accept the world as it was, instead of as it could be. And he built from that single starting point something that touched millions of lives and outlasted every obstacle that tried to stop it. And you have something to, you have a starting point. You have a vision, even if it is not yet fully clear. You have the capacity to refuse and to persist and to build. And the world is not waiting for someone perfect. It is not waiting for someone who has all the answers or all the resources or all the confidence. It is waiting for someone who is willing to begin, someone who is willing to show up imperfectly and consistently and with everything they have. And that person can be you. It has always been able to be you. The only thing that has ever stood between you and that version of your life is the decision to start. And that decision is available to you right now, not tomorrow, not when things are easier, right now, in this moment, with what you have, where you are. The same way a boy from the Bronx once looked at a world that told him no and decided that his answer was yes.